Hey friends, I'm Jeffrey Rickman and this is PlainSpoken. This is a channel that I began a year and a half ago aimed at shedding light on developments in Methodism broadly and the Global Methodist Church and the United Methodist Church. It's been going pretty well, and I've had the honor of speaking to a lot of really joyful, wonderful, intelligent, conscientious people. Today, it's finally time for me to speak with Mr. Mark Tooley, who's been a huge influence on Methodism ever since I've been clergy for a long time. Mark Tooley became president of the Institute for Religion and Democracy in 2009. He joined in 1994 to found its United Methodist Committee, which is today Action. He is also the editor of IRD's foreign policy and national security journal called Providence. Prior to joining the IRD, Mark worked 8 years for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and a native of Arlington, Virginia. He's a lifelong United Methodist. He's been active in the UMC renewal movement since 1988 when he wrote a study about denominational funding of pro-Marxist groups for his local congregation. He attends the United Methodist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. He's the author of Taking Back the United Methodist Church, published in 2008, Methodism and Politics in the 20th Century, which I read a few years ago, published in 2012, and The Peace That Almost Was, a Forgotten Story of the 1861 Washington Peace Conference and the Final Attempt to Avert Civil War, which is published in 2015. And he has articles that are featured in the Wall Street Journal, the American Spectator, First Things, Pathos, World Christianity Today, the Weekly Standard, National Review Online, Washington Examiner, Human Events, the Washington Times, several more I'm tired of reading. Mark is obviously a person to be taken seriously. I see him most regularly on Twitter nowadays, but I've been reading his blogs and articles for years, ever since I was the pastor of a 3-point rural charge in Idaho. Mark has been the bogeyman of many a liberal in the United Methodist Church. They have published lots of propaganda against him, alleged many nasty things about him and his character. I've really admired him because he's continued to serve despite mean things being said about him. The United Methodist General Conference concluded last week with what I consider to be the death knell of the denomination. I thought it fitting to talk with Mark, Rob Renfro, Tom Lambrecht, maybe a few others, as kind of a post-mortem about what's happened in the United Methodist Church and how it is that people of good faith should meditate upon such things. So I reached out to Mark, and he was very gracious to accept my invitation. So I've talked enough about him, and I'm ready to speak to him now. Mark, thanks for joining me today. How are you, friend?
Hey, great to be with you, and grateful for your broadcast, which really have entered into the mainstream of Methodist online conversation.
Well, and I'm glad to be doing it with you. You've done a lot of this yourself. I've watched you interview some people that I admire. I know you had an interview with Glenn Lowry one time that I really like that guy a lot. But also, there's some peacenik, I can't think of his name. That's he's like a hippie. Anyway, that was Shane Claiborne. Yeah, that's right. And so you know what it's like to talk to people. Your format is a little bit more concise than mine. If you've seen me before, I'm kind of all over the place, and it's unfortunate because I've watched people like you for years, and I've got 1,000 questions, but I've only got you for an hour, so I got to focus on just what's pertinent right now. So I thought maybe it would be really good. Of course, a lot of people watching this are going to know who you are. But for people who don't know who you are, maybe you could give your story about like where you came from, what brought you into the United Methodist Church, how it is that you got to be involved in kind of policy and procedure around all that.
I grew up in the United Methodist Church in Arlington, Virginia. At age 20, I became my church's lay member of the Virginia Annual Conference. So I started my entrance into United Methodist politics began in 1985. 1987, 88, I became missions chair for my congregation and discovered the controversial policies of the United Methodist Board of Global Ministries up in New York, which basically had stepped back from missions evangelism in place of replaced it with political action, often very radical, often funding Marxist revolutionary groups as the best means for expressing solidarity with the poor and the third world, especially in Latin America. That scandalized me. I knew most Methodists didn't know about that. So I wrote up a 18-page report about those funding practices, shared with my congregation, and mailed it to dozens and ultimately hundreds of other churches in the Virginia conference. And that led to my activism to try to reform the missions board and ultimately to try to reform the whole denomination, which took me to the 1992 General Conference to serve on the Good News legislative team. And so I attended every General Conference from 92 through 2019 as an advocate and joined the staff, as you mentioned, of the Institute on Religion and Democracy to begin its United Methodist work in 1994. So it's been over 3 decades of United Methodist work, and it's wonderful and providential to finally have it conclude literally in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, you weren't able to be there. Was that an intentional decision? Did you think it would be bad to have you there, or was it just were there conflicts? What was that?
Very intentional. IRD did not have a presence at General Conference. We saw no purpose behind it. The fight was over, and we had nothing more to. We have plenty to say about it, but the activism part of IRD, in terms of the United Methodist Church and the mainline churches, and really denominations as a whole, has concluded.
Yeah, it was a very firm statement whenever John Lamperis was dismissed from the IRD on good terms. My impression is that he did fantastic work, but there is no UM action anymore because the activism is over, and now he's found wonderful employment in the GMC. I think he's going to be great in service to the GMC, but a very loud statement made by the IRD that you folks were not intending to interfere with the United Methodist Church in any way as it signed its own death warrant, I guess is how I would put it. I wonder, so the question I had about you, I didn't know, so you were in the United Methodist Church at 20 years old. Were you raised in the United Methodist Church?
Yes, lifelong.
Okay, you're cradle Methodist, and so, but there also the CIA came in there for a bit. You were with them for 8 years, did your bio say?
Yes, I started when I was still a college student, and I stayed through age 29.
That's incredible. Okay, so I might have more questions about that. Who knows? But the stuff I knew that I needed to focus on with you before we got into talking about the United Methodist Church and modern Methodism, I've spent a little bit of time trying to understand you because you are so influential, and you are not a two-dimensional, simple person. You're actually a very thoughtful person that engages on a very serious level with international thinkers like Yoram Hazony and other conservative. You are not, I don't even know what labels to apply to you. I'm more of like a reactionary conservative with libertarian sensibilities. I think you're more of an old school conservative that is optimistic in the power of policy and dialogue and goodwill. And would you agree with that characterization?
That sounds accurate. Of course, I'm a lot older than you, and I came of age in the 1980s under Reagan, but I would self-identify as a classical liberal and as a Whig, W-H-I-G. I love using that word.
Yeah, you're big on that word, and I see that, and I'm ashamed that I still don't have a full comprehension of where that enters into the modern conservative conservatism. I see liberalism and progressivism as a very narrow place to be right now, increasingly narrow. It seems to me that the right is increasingly broad, and there's a huge diversity of opinion and optional frameworks through which to see the world. Do you have a succinct definition of what Whiggery would be for people who don't understand that yet?
It's the whole Anglo-American tradition of ordered liberty dating back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and including the Declaration of Independence, of course, including the Constitution, of course, including Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, of course. So it believes in constitutional lawful rule, limited government, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection for dissent. But also, I think it has a somewhat optimistic take about what's possible for the future. It believes in government in terms of its rightful vocation. It believes in building institutions. Without institutions, we cannot have a viable future.
Yeah, that was an interesting connection point between you and Richard Ackerman, Redeem Zoomer, who you also interviewed, because both of you agree very much on the importance of institutions, but disagreed on, well, and you didn't disagree with him. You just gave him a platform for it to, but as I understand your thought and his thought, he thinks it's a realistic and morally incumbent thing to reclaim these institutions that have been lost. Whereas, though you're an optimist, generally you're not that optimistic. You do see it as necessary to maybe engage in what might be termed a Boniface option, where there's a creation of alternate institutions for a time to take the place of old institutions. How closely have I characterized you to what you actually are?
Well, the big shift in American religion since I was the age of redeemed Zoomer is that denominations and denominationalism almost don't matter anymore in America, for better or for worse. Almost no one under the age of 60, except for a few eccentric people like the redeemed Zoomer, and as I would have been at his age, care very much about denominations or what church their grandparents belong to. And so we can't operate in that paradigm any longer.
So institutions matter, but not denominations. Would I be fair in saying that?
Not denominations as they have existed in America for the last 200 plus years, and the great Protestant institutions that arose out of the Second Great Awakening are now fast fading from the scene, and new institutions and new movements are rising up to fill the vacuum. So that's mostly good news.
Okay, so you think that the new institutions, I'm sorry to put words in your mouth, but correct me if I'm wrong. You think the new institutions, maybe including the Global Methodist Church, will be up to the task of taking the place of those former institutions that can no longer function in this contemporary setting?
Well, we don't know yet whether they're up to the task, but we have to work hard to make sure that they become viable and long-term and do fill the vacuum left by the mainline Protestant world. But that's a huge canyon to fill. Mainline Protestantism was the central structure of civil society in America for most of our history. And so many of the social problems we're dealing with today and the polarization, a lot of that is due to the collapse of mainline Protestantism.
Yeah, well, Ackerman has done some videos that have helped me, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say I hadn't appreciated fully all the things that these large denominational institutions built in the 20th century, and how the Global Methodist Church, I can speak to them. They're not taking in enough money to even seriously think about wielding the might and cultural influence that the United Methodist Church and its predecessors had. So that's why Ackerman, I think, is right to at least push the case for, hey, we shouldn't leave these institutions behind, because then we are ceding all of this ground that was once upon a time claimed for Christ. So this building that GBCS has right down the street from the Capitol, people like me have learned to go, oh, this was Christian nationalism at its worst, and us trying to influence modern government at its worst. But there's a way of looking at that going, oh, well, of course the Church of Jesus Christ is going to try and be a leavening agent for all of society and have a positive impact. And it does seem like newer denominational entities are not at all positioned to do that or take its place, which does seem kind of sad to me. But it sounds to me as though you're still optimistic, though. So maybe you could talk about. I'm not an optimist. I'm kind of a cynical pessimist. What do you see right now to be optimistic about in the American religious landscape?
Well, American religion has always been very dynamic and entrepreneurial. De Tocqueville talks about it in the 1830s. The Methodists were the chief example of how entrepreneurial American religion was at the start, with no structures, no institutions, just scores and then hundreds of fervent young men who were preaching the gospel and willing to imperil themselves by riding the circuit on the frontier. And so great institutions arose from their sacrifices. I hope that some of that will be reenacted today, and that the Global Methodist Church, but not limited to the Global Methodist Church, other aspects of exited United Methodism and the other Wesleyan denominations, such that they exist, will be part of a renewed vitality. That's not going to be a great national bureaucratic denomination. It was always a little bit exhilarating to be active in trying to reform and quote unquote take back a great national denomination because it had national influence, and what happened to it seemed to have great spiritual, political, cultural importance. But there really is almost no national religious institution in America anymore that has that importance. There is the Catholic Church in America. The Southern Baptist Convention is the last great national denomination, but I think its influence is fast waning. So what's rising up and what's left behind, of course, mostly non-denominational Christianity that don't have national structures. But then you also have rising new informal or somewhat formal networks of churches that band together to collaborate, but they don't have large bureaucracies, agencies, national leaders, or a strong national identity. I think that's where the Global Methodist Church would be. It's not going to build up a board of global ministries. It's not going to have a board of church and society. It's not going to have a board of higher education. It's not going to found scores of universities or set up new seminaries likely. It's going to be a network of thousands of churches that collaborate, but also sort of do their own thing as they feel led to.
Yeah, even as you're talking and I'm asking for this optimistic picture, I'm just so ingrained in my way of seeing things that I'm just going, oh, that sounds awful. But also, I am kind of an old school American where I believe much more in local institutions than I do with top-down federalized institutions. So I'm trying to remind myself as you're talking about all that has been lost and all that's different. I want to talk about how ideological leftism works, because that's really where you cut your teeth at the beginning. Before we go there, though, I want to talk about Christian nationalism, because a lot of people would hear you talk about Whiggery and the fact that the phrase Anglo the prefix Anglo came out of your mouth. They would maybe conclude, oh, this fits into this framework I have of a white Christian nationalist, and Tooley must be one of them. You are regularly sparring with Christian. Well, you don't spar. Your attitude on Twitter or X or whatever is not combative. It's more kind of like you're unaffected by them. Kind of. You'll have a couple clear things you say that lead to questions rather than conclusions. So I'm confused a lot of the time. But where are the key places where you find yourself in disagreement with and of course Christian nationalism is it's not all one thing. But where do you find yourself really pushing back in that contemporary conversation?
Well, thank you for raising the topic. I love talking about Christian nationalism, and so do a lot of people. So many progressives love obsessing over Christian nationalism because, according to their narrative, all traditional Christians active in politics are by definition Christian nationalists, or sometimes they take it even further. Any talk about God or faith in public life is Christian nationalism. So if you accept that definition, every president from Washington to Biden is a Christian nationalist because they refer to God in their speeches and public comments. And of course, that's ridiculous. Christian nationalism, I suppose, more properly understood, is a conflation of Christian faith with the nation. And there probably are millions of mostly well-meaning Americans who have sort of a populist folk religion that ties the nation and their faith together. I remember 2 years ago attending a conservative Methodist church in the exurbs of Northern Virginia, and an older man sitting in front of me in the pew with a T-shirt with Jesus on the cross and an American flag draped over the shoulders of Jesus. I thought, finally, I've seen a real live Christian nationalist right here in front of me. So there's that going on, but I think more distressing to me and more substantively, there is a rising, small but still influential cohort of Christian thinkers, Protestants, almost always Calvinists, who self-identify proudly as Christian nationalists, and they advocate for a Christian, perhaps even a specifically Calvinist confessional state. So they would reject classical liberalism. They would reject, to some extent, the First Amendment of the Constitution. They would reject the idea of complete religious liberty for all people. Mm-hmm. They would say America should be a legally, by statute, Christian nation that privileges Christianity and Christians over other faiths, which, of course, I find very distressing. My organization, the Institute on Religion and Democracy, was founded in 1981 specifically to advocate for human rights, religious freedom for all people, regardless of faith.
So when people surely run into this argument that the Whiggery and the ideological framework that you're so fond of is directly the byproduct of the Christian faith, could not exist out of any other religious structure, and if we make room for other religious faiths to take root in America, then you can say goodbye to your precious Whiggery. What's the response?
Well, I would say it's true that what I call Whiggery, or others would simply call democracy, did emerge in the 1600s from England and the Netherlands, from a specifically Protestant perspective that made paramount the liberty of conscience and wanting to limit the powers of the government to protect liberty of conscience. So it did emerge with that understanding of transcendence that was Christian and specifically Protestant. But it's important to note that it's not just for Christians, it's not just for Protestants. It speaks to a universal ideal. And so I think those who contend for liberty in Hong Kong or in the Ukraine or in Nicaragua or in Venezuela, in some sense, they are all Whigs in that they believe in liberty of conscience, religious freedom, limited government, rule of law. And so not maybe, I think you absolutely had to have Christianity to develop that concept, but I think that it speaks to the human spirit, and in that sense, it is a divine gift for all of humanity.
All right, let me say back to you what I think I'm hearing you say. There's a long-standing debate between Steven Pinker and Ben Shapiro, two influential Jewish thinkers in America. Uh, uh, Ben says that American ideals, structure, fabric is built on Judeo-Christian narrative worldview, and as that falls apart, so will the Western liberal project, and especially as you import a bunch of immigrants from non-Jewish or non-Christian areas, you're going to see all of these things fall apart. Steven Pinker, I think, is advocating the position you are, acknowledging, yes, the ideology of Judeo-Christian worldview did create these ideas, but you no longer need that undergirding belief structure in order to support the notion of human rights and the well-being of all. And these things can be maintained without an explicitly Christian framework undergirding it. How much do you resemble Steven Pinker's perspective there? I think I just heard you say, yes, it came from Christianity, but Christianity is not needed to maintain it, and indeed it's taken root in non-Christian areas of the world just fine.
I would land in between, and we mustn't forget that we, as Americans, as Westerners, like to speak of the decline of Christianity, but there have never been more Christians on the face of the earth than right now. There are at least 2.5 billion on the face of the earth who profess Christianity. So the church is not going away, and it's always leaven to the world. And so, yes, liberty, constitutional government, what I call Whiggery, what others would call democracy, all of its citizens don't need to be Christians for it to work, but it is rooted in a transcendent premise that is Christian in origin. And I think it needs to be continually reinforced and fertilized by Christians and other people who have a sense of transcendence to remind us that we all are living under the judgment and mercy of God. And we also have to remember, let's not idealize the past. It's not as though the majority of Americans in 1776 or 1787 were devout Christians, reading their Bibles, going to church. That was in many ways a secular time, but Christians and Christianity were absolutely essential to developing who we are as Americans.
I want to talk to you so much longer about that stuff, but I can't. We don't have time. But I have a lot more to learn from you about that stuff because I listen to a lot of people who say different things. Let's talk about leftism. Well, and the segue here will be a lot of the reactionary right-leaning voices I listen to are very much intimidated by the dual threat of atheism and Islamism. Islamism being a bigger and bigger threat in the West because many immigrants from Islamic countries have come in and are inevitably going to influence the social fabric that we all share and already are. And they don't share a lot of the same presuppositions that are at least commonly said to belong to the Judeo-Christian worldview. Atheism, on the other hand, is ultimately nihilistic and narcissistic, and to my mind, just ends in death. Well, I think both end in death, honestly, if you're just asking me. I I don't get the impression that you agree with me there, but I do get the impression, and you can correct me, that you do agree that radical leftism is indeed a terrible threat, and that's where I said I understood you could cut your teeth when talking about these communist guerrillas and mainline denominational dollars going to communist militant efforts around the world. That's obviously, or at least at that point, self-evidently a bad thing. It seems to me right-leaning reactionary voices are saying, okay, given the nature of those threats, we have to escalate. Enlightenment Western thought has been revealed to be insufficient to combat those forces. That they are spreading, they're growing, and in the West, at least, gaining where Christianity is declining. So what's the corrective you offer against that concern, knowing that you see the same things? You've seen what leftism does whenever it gets to operate in darkness. So what's the corrective there to those like me who are prone to go a bit crazy in the reaction?
Well, Christianity is strong globally. Obviously, it has retreated in the West, especially in Europe, but also in the United States. And the vacuum it leaves behind is being filled by other forces. And in Europe, those other forces seem to include almost neo-pagan far-right forces that are almost sort of pre-Christian in their understanding, or sometimes they adopt a cultural Christian moniker in order to identify themselves against what they would call the Islamic threat, but actually they're more pre-Christian in their perspective. And so how do we contend with that? I would say in much of the West, the threat may not be from the traditional old Marxist left, which has never quite recovered from the fall of the Soviet Union, but obviously there's the culturally leftist, the so-called woke left, and then there's the new far right. I think both of them, well, I think the far right is often pre-Christian, neo-pagan. The far left is more post-Christian. They want Christian ideals about equality without the transcendence or the morality of it. And so that is what we as Christians and we as Americans and we as believers in democracy are contending against. So what do we do? Well, if you're a Christian, the best thing you can do to contend against these anarchic forces is to build up the church and to build up Christian institutions. But there are a lot of people on the right who don't want to talk about the church, who want to bypass the need for re-evangelate. How do I say that word? Re-evangelization, yes. And instead want to resort to political means, to call for some kind of authoritarianism, who want to talk about maybe half smilingly, but also half seriously, maybe we need a Protestant Franco, maybe we need a strong man, maybe democracy has failed, maybe we need to coerce society with a bayonet or at the point of gun to, quote unquote, re-Christianize it. And of course, that will not work.
Yeah, for you, it's an of course. For a lot of people, it's not an of course. And of course, I'm thinking of Operation Reconquista again, because the term that they got that from is from chasing the Moors out of Spain. Islam has spread by the force of the sword ever since its beginning, and there have been attempts to evangelize them, but the most effective way to beat them back has been quite literally, and that's what the Crusades was. That's what the Operation Reconquista was, and that's what people in the West are saying needs to happen, maybe in Europe and America now. I'm not sympathetic with that kind of military. We need to physically force them out. I do find myself open to the notion that perhaps there needs to be a less passive, more aggressive approach to advancing the Christian faith. I don't know what that looks like, so I guess I better stop talking about it. But I see a big part of what you've done. I watched Wesley Biblical Seminary just honored you, gave you an honorary doctorate. So I meant to introduce you as the Dr. Mark Tooley whenever I brought you on. But Matt Friedman was talking about you before your introduction and said that your primary role, as he's seen you, has been just to show up, pay attention, and then report to people what is being said and done. And that's where you started. And I find myself another apologist for the liberal project. The Enlightenment liberal project has been James Lindsay, who is also of the mind that the project is not over, but the way that you combat it is simply by talking about what your enemies are doing, shining a light on what they're doing, saying, here's what I see you doing. I know you're doing it. We all know you're doing it. We're not going to let you get away with it. And I've seen your ministry in the IRD largely being that. Does it sound like I've got you pegged right?
In many ways, yeah. So the big task 30 years ago was just to wake up United Methodist people who did not know what was happening beyond their local church. This was before the internet. They had never heard of the Board of Global Ministries in New York. They had never heard of the Board of Church Society in Washington, D.C. They didn't really know about the General Conference. And so these church agencies and bishops were making often outrageous political pronouncements in the church's name without any accountability to the church's members. So to my youthful mind and youthful idealism, if the Methodist people only knew what was being done, they would pick up their pitchforks and storm Dracula's castle and take back their church. It wasn't that simple, and the church had gotten to where it was in large part because that ignorance was often willful and the result of passivity. And so progressives were able to take over the structures of our denomination really early in the 20th century. We like to think, oh, the church is not what it was for our parents or grandparents. Well, it was. The church was progressive in the time of our great grandparents and even before. We just didn't realize it. So my ministry was waking people up in the age before the internet and beyond. Now, I guess it's safe to say most people who care have an easy ability to find out what's going on in the church. But even now, probably most church members don't care about the denomination. Most church members probably don't care about what happened at last week's General Conference, but many do. And many are going to be making some big decisions in the coming weeks and months about their future and where they will be worshiping.
That's interesting. So you've said a lot of things that it surprises me to hear you say that you still think there are a lot of people who don't care about what happened. To my mind, what happened is so extreme that even people who've been avoiding it can't help but care because it's going to make a statement on them and their local church, when people in America are going to learn to associate that cross and flame with the rainbow flag as well. And I don't know how many you can't not care at this point, So I already knew what direction we were gonna go, and I was gonna say, Mark, what do we say about all these people, despite all your efforts, that still just had no idea what was happening until last week? And I think I just heard you say that was a willful decision on their part. They didn't want to know, and still, if it were up to them, they wouldn't know. And you know what? I think I agree with you, actually. I think there's a certain stereotype I have in my head of baby boomers that just want to take what they're fed. They just want to turn on the nightly news, listen to what Tom Brokaw's saying. They just want to listen to the NIH and the FBI and trust that everybody is leading them in the right direction, and there isn't this critical thinking mechanism that can kind of like question what they're being told. And in some sense, they deserve what's happened to them. Maybe I've gone too far in that direction, or do you think that really is the case, and that one of the lessons learned here is don't trust what you're being told?
Well, just as we get the government we deserve, we get the church that we deserve. And if we're not actively engaged, the consequences are predictable, and there will be consequences for this General Conference. So up until several years ago, the average departure rate for the United Methodist Church, or annual decline, was maybe just under 100,000. Then it went up before 2019 up to 200,000 a year. Now we just had the exit of almost 7,700 churches that, at least on paper, probably included about 1.5 million people. So the church is probably down from its high of 11 million in the U.S. down to approaching 4 million. I think the annual exit rate for the next several years will probably be 300,000 or 400,000 a year. So the United Methodist Church is probably going to sink down to 2 million pretty quickly. So there are consequences, but for the majority, they don't care about the denomination. They like their local church. They like their local pastor. what happens at some convention hundreds of miles away every 4 years doesn't concern them. But there is this big change in how Methodists think. When I was growing up, my grandmother's generation, we're United Methodist women. We pay our apportionments. We follow the discipline. We are United Methodists no matter what, and we're proud of it. And that attitude is almost entirely gone. So whether you're progressive, whether you're conservative, whether you're in between, are you interested in having your building owned by somebody else? Are you interested in having your pastor appointed by somebody else? Are you interested in sending thousands of dollars off to a distant bureaucracy about which you know little? The answers are no, 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 no. And which is why I think in 10 years, the United Methodist Church effectively will not exist as a national denomination, just because it was created in a different age and can't be sustained by the attitudes of today's churchgoers.
Yeah, I think that would be very difficult to disagree with. I think I could pick how much they have in reserves and how it could be invested indefinitely in order to maintain a smaller skeleton crew indefinitely, especially if they combine with the Episcopal Church, which it looks like the groundwork is potentially being laid for. But even so, that really doesn't matter, because what's at stake is the way I would characterize what just happened is at the General Conference, there was a hostile progressive takeover that effectively forced out everybody with conservative or even centrist sensibilities because of how far left everything went. And so that they're betting on black, so to speak. It's a real gamble. They believe that by signaling this strongly to the left, that they will be able to call to themselves all leftists and urban centers who want Jesus. And what they don't understand is there aren't many, and it's a foundation of sinking sand. How much of that do you think you like all that? Does that sound real, or am I being hyperbolic?
Well, that sounds correct. We know where this trajectory takes you. We've already seen what happens to the United Church of Christ, which is probably the furthest left denomination and took this path explicitly in the 1990s, or the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church USA, whose rates of decline have been faster than for the United Methodist Church. So all kinds of negative trends are coming together at the same time: the collapse of denominational loyalties, the lack of interest in supporting national bureaucracies, the preference for local autonomy, and then the liberal sexual standards, which a lot of people think, oh, well, that's in sync with American culture. This will be popular. But people looking to be in sync with popular trends aren't taking the trouble to get up early to go to church on Sunday morning. The people who are taking the trouble to go to church, much less be active and financially support the church, are looking for something a little bit different, something that's challenging, that seems a little more permanent, something they want to raise their children in. And so just an echo of the secular culture is not going to command their loyalty. So often, one anecdote, back when same-sex marriage was legalized by the Supreme Court, a pastor of a DC church plant was saying, and it was an evangelical church, he was saying most of our young professionals are fine with legalized same-sex marriage, which I thought, oh, well, you could see that as disturbing, but I saw it as encouraging. They're socially liberal, but dozens of socially liberal, largely empty mainline churches in DC with their rainbow flags, these young people are not going there. Why is that? Well, they're going to a more conservative church that proclaims permanent values, because they realize, even if they're not fully on board, that there's a power there, there's an energy there that they're not going to find in the liberal church.
It's so hard, I anticipate a progressive listening to us and going, well, if the way that you're different from the world is that you hate gay people, count me out. And that would be a very disingenuous way of hearing what you just said. The way I would frame it a little bit is the way that we are to be a peculiar people is to believe that the way we behave sexually matters and corresponds with eternal values, and that there are certain things that the culture says are okay, that there is an external ontological God who says otherwise, and we submit to him rather than the zeitgeist. That's what I believe people. That's not the only thing. It's just one emblematic thing, the easiest thing to grasp at in the ways in which Christians are called to be different. But there are dozens, if not hundreds or thousands, of ways in which Christians are supposed to be peculiar and stand against whatever culture we're in. And our culture here is wanting to teach children to let their freak flag fly, and we want our children to be chaste and holy, and there is no shame in that. And I feel like I don't even need to ask your feedback on that. Surely you're on the same page as me with respect to all that.
There's no major Christian movement in the world that's sexually progressive that is growing. I think it's safe to say there's no major religion in the world that's sexually progressive that is growing. I think by definition, people seek out religions that are demanding and exacting and call for some sense of self-denial and lifts them up above the monotony of daily life.
Well, I wonder what you'll say to this. I think that cultural leftism is a religion. I think that it is growing in the West. I think that the religion of narcissism and self-aggrandizement and giving in to one's feelings and associating one's identity with one's desires is the primary growing religion in the West. And it's like Buddhism. It has no God, but even so, it is a moral, not just a moral, an ideological framework from which one becomes a lens through which everyone views everything in the world. In that sense, it's not. I'll be a little more hyperbolic, and then I'll let you be the reasonable one. I would say it's more of a cult than a religion, but I would also say it's a form of mass formation psychosis that is dependent upon a highly synthetic, materialist worldview. So I think it's ultimately unsustainable and self-defeating, but it's like a cancer. You know, a cancer grows within a body. Cancer can't grow indefinitely. Eventually, you're going to kill the body, but it doesn't stop growing, and that's how this works. I'm already spreading out too far, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to say I'm also sympathetic with the notion that the Frankfurt School did create a new iteration of Marxism, usually called neo-Marxism, that is to be associated with wokeism as well. It's a direct correlation here. So I just threw a bunch of words together in a big word salad, and I don't know how much that fits with what you experience as reality, or if you really do think that it is the framework of religion versus atheism.
Well, it's not necessarily one or the other. There are the great organized religions, and then there are these in the West post-Christian spiritualities and cultural fads that try to imitate religion in some sense, but even they, in their imitation, call for some sense of sacrifice and giving up things. I'm going to recycle. I'm not going to use my automobile anymore, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to appease my conscience by giving up this or giving up that. So, and in fact, that's kind of an echo of loosely of Christianity, the idea that there's some at least amorphous deity out there whose sense of justice must be appeased by our denying ourselves.
That's such a fun answer. And of course, you can apply it to BLM, where the original sin is whiteness, and the answer is owning one's privilege. You know, that's the form of contrition. You know, that these things are all like pale reflections of true religion that only Christ. I love that. I think that's a wonderful response. Let's talk about the United Methodist Church, and then have a hopeful note for the Global Methodist Church at the end. The United Methodist Church. Could you summarize what for people who don't know, and most people do, but what are all the changes that happened over the last couple of weeks that just signaled how far gone the United Methodist Church is?
Well, so much of the talk is about homosexuality, but the sweeping changes were not about homosexuality. The sweeping change was sex has been completely disconnected from marriage, which the Church Universal has taught from the very beginning, this idea of monogamy in marriage and celibacy in singleness. And this is metaphorically an imitation of Christ's relationship with his church, which is itself a cosmic wedding. So all of that was deleted from United Methodist standards, and now sexuality, loosely defined, is just sort of affirmed as long as it's faithful and has integrity. So there are no parameters, and we all know what happens to religions that don't have parameters. They don't last because people are all looking for guardrails. So I don't think the United Methodist Church, as I said earlier, is going to exist in its current format in 10 years. But here's the good news. As people care less and less about denominations, there are going to be a lot of United Methodists who don't care about General Conference and in their local church, but they may be reading good things, and their local church may be participating in events put on by Global Methodist related institutions, and they may have an interest in Wesleyan theology. No one's reading official United Methodist Sunday school materials. No one's ordering materials from United Methodist Publishing House. No one cares whether or not a book or an online resource is United Methodist. People are finding their own way. So I think as United Methodism collapses, there are going to be a lot of individuals and churches that haven't formally exited, but they may be aligning consciously or not with a new Orthodox form of Wesleyanism.
Do you think, you said that progressivism was firmly rooted in the United Methodist Church? Well, I heard you, I think, say before it was even the United Methodist Church, early 20th century. So do you think that this defeat was always inevitable, or do you think that there was a certain point at which it became inevitable?
The split was inevitable, and yes, progressives took the seminaries early in the 20th century, solidified by the 1920s, had the agencies, had most of the clergy, certainly by the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The evangelical renewal movement began in the 1960s. It was always a subculture. It was always a besieged minority. Barely had any dreams of becoming a majority in the church. The big change that inflated some expectations was the unforeseen rise of the African church within a couple of decades that suddenly gave U.S. evangelicals at least a legislative majority at the General Conference that postponed sexual liberalization by 20 years. It would have happened in 2004 without the Africans. So that gave evangelicals breathing space to coalesce and organize and prepare for the eventual schism. Otherwise, had United Methodism officially liberalized in 2004, it would have ended as it did for the Episcopal Church, with hundreds of churches litigating, trying to save their property, but thousands of congregations just having to go along, and the denomination, including its Orthodox believers, just fading into the sunset. So, but thanks to the Africans, evangelicals were able to organize a formal exit that included, as you know, 25% of all the churches, which has no precedent in American religious history, and I'm not sure if it really has a precedent in global Christian history.
Yeah, it really has been. Well, and according to some measures, when you compare how many churches are still in the UMC versus the last time it was measured, I've seen a third are now gone, but a lot of those were not to 2553, but 2549. But I'm of the mind that a third of the denomination actually exited because of their distaste for the direction things were going. And that's despite so many still not knowing what's going on, and so many conferences not allowing them out, and so many conferences charging way too much money. So it is a huge referendum on how palatable their ideology is. The Global Methodist Church and other strains of Christianity need to learn the lessons, lest they reproduce the errors that went in this direction. And as I see it, we're currently having that conversation. You, me, hundreds, thousands of other people are trying to figure out what went wrong so that we can do it right this time. To my mind, what was done wrong was we created an unresponsive bureaucracy that could not remove malevolent entities within it. So if the Global Methodist Church wants to imagine itself being a robust institution in the long term, then it needs to have a responsive executive entity that can quickly and effectively remove malicious persons from the denomination. That's what I understood to be the strength of early Methodism, with John Wesley and Francis Asbury being strong executives, and with it being an exclusive society where they summarily dismissed people who were disorderly walkers. That's something that I'm arguing needs to be reclaimed. To your mind, I'm not going to ask how realistic you think that is, because nobody thinks that's realistic. But to your mind, do you think that that extreme answer is the only answer, or do you think that there is something perhaps more reasonable and less bothersome that could reasonably be expected to protect the GMC in the long term?
Definitely a strong system to uphold theological and ethical accountability. But again, we're dealing in this new form of American Christianity that is more congregationalist and less patient with authority from denomination. So I think the greatest protective valve for the Global Methodists is congregations own their own property, and if things are not going well, they will simply exit again or reorganize, or there'll be another schism. So the Global Methodist Church, if it's to be successful, will have to uphold orthodoxy and operate on a consensus basis to keep everyone together and moving forward.
And you would agree that that limits the degree to which we can expect everybody to work together?
To coercively work together, yes, there's going to have to be a lot of voluntary collaboration. So sometimes I hear from people who want the Global Methodist Church to come to their town and plant a new congregation. And I have to point out, well, they don't have the money, they don't have the people, they were just organized 5 minutes ago. Why don't you organize a new congregation? Why don't you take the initiative? So Global Methodism is all about self-initiative, hopefully driven by the Holy Spirit.
Well, and a strong laity, of course, is implied there as well,
Right.
which, of course, is innate to authentic Methodism.
Yes,
So,
passive laity. It's not, the Global Methodism is not going to work with passive laity.
exactly. Are you still currently within the umbrella of the United Methodist Church?
Yes, my membership, and I attend a United Methodist Church whose pastor is traditional, but may be retiring soon. But the Washington, D.C. area is a Methodist wasteland. 5 million people. In Northern Virginia, there were 3 small exiting churches. In the city itself, nothing. In suburban Maryland, I know of 1. So options are very, very few. I'm trying to raise money to plant a new church in downtown DC that would meet in IRD's office. So our new church planner pastor would not have to worry about space, administration, finances, and we need to plant a new church in where I live in Alexandria, Virginia. So a lot to do. I'm not expecting anybody else to come in and plant these churches. I'm trying to organize the funding, gather the funding so that we can do it ourselves.
United Methodist Churches?
No, these would be
Okay.
Global Methodist.
I was going to say that. So you're currently still within the UMC, but
Right.
that has a time limit on it, and you're actually participating in the church planting effort for the GMC.
I'm trying to raise the money so I can hire someone to do the church planting.
Interesting. Okay, so you and I are going to be in the same tribe again. We've had a brief time apart, and you're going to come over to the GMC. So what things? Pretend that you are, I know this is inimical to Whiggery, but pretend that you are king of the Global Methodists for a day. What sermon would you give to all of the Global Methodists as to what you want them to be praying about and working towards together?
Church planting and evangelism, Methodism, Wesleyanism has virtually died on the West Coast, the Northeast, in all of America's great cities. College campuses disappeared. Either those areas have become secular, or everyone has become some form of Baptist or Calvinist, and we pray for God's blessings on them. But Methodism needs to replant. And even if you're a small church or you're a struggling church, I think the greatest project that'll revitalize you and energize you is to start planting new churches in your community.
Cool. I don't know how many people have associated your name with a passion for church planting, but it sounds like they're going to. So far as IRD is concerned, how much overlap is there going to be between the work that you're doing there and the Global Methodist Church?
IRD shut down Action, our activist program within United Methodism. We have our John Wesley Institute for Theological Formation.
That's right.
And the Wesleyan community, all denominations, or even if you're not in a denomination, we convened 2 summits of Methodist theologians, the first of which released a 20,000 word distillation of Wesleyan theology called The Faith Once Delivered. Our more recent summit has drafted a statement on Wesleyan holiness. We're doing regional schools of Methodism. So if you have a church or a group of churches who can pull together a couple hundred people, we'll bring in 7 theologians to share the basics of Wesleyan theology. And then finally the project that no one else is going to pick up the baton for. So it's our responsibility is to develop a Wesleyan political theology. We're organizing a smallish summit, maybe this summer, to bring together some scholars to articulate what a Wesleyan political theology looks like.
Interesting. Okay, well, I could go another hour just on asking questions about that, but we've reached our allotted time. So the way I'd like to conclude is just to thank you, Mr. Tooley, for spending pretty much your entire adult life in the service of Methodists, and for not giving up now, but just simply entering into a new chapter. I think yours is a mind that well, I've really enjoyed probing it. So thanks for being willing to humor me and explain yourself to me, who I'm not entitled to anything, but I sure hope it's been a benefit to those who've spent time with us. I know it's been of benefit to me, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the same denomination.
Thank you for your voice, and you are an incarnation of the new Methodism. No one asked you to take to the airwave to do what you're doing. You simply took that upon yourself, and I hope many, many others do the same, and that will recapture America for Methodism.
Well, you heard it, everybody. Mark Tooley likes me, so you better like me too. Subscribe to me wherever you are, and sign up to stay along with me. Comment. I want to know how you received this conversation. I know it was kind of heady, but these are ideas that are very impactful in the world around us, and they're not going to go away. And I think it's to our benefit to really try and understand Mr. Tooley and Whiggery, even though I've never liked that term, but I think it's a real thing that we need to understand. And I appreciate y'all coming along on the ride with me, and pray for Mr. Tooley as he continues to serve the church. All right, I'll say goodbye now. Bye, friends.